record. We're all set?
I think so.
Okay. So hi everybody and welcome to today's session, Proclaiming the Roots and Realities of Indigenous-Black peoples on Turtle Island, a CBR approach. This is the second webinar in our three-part webinar and discussion series on community-based research with Indigenous and racialized communities, and it's hosted by Community-Based Research Canada. My name is Julia Coburn. I'm the CBR Canada Program Coordinator and the moderator for today's session. This webinar, we're pleased to share, has closed captioning available, which you're able to turn on or off if you go to the bottom right hand of your screen and you click on closed captioning. So first, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the CBR Canada Secretariat is situated on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And in the spirit of reconciliation, CBR Canada is committed to engaging with and learning from diverse Indigenous peoples and communities across Canada, as well as addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, including Action 62, which seemed quite relevant to today's discussion. A bit about CBR Canada. Our mission is to advance community-based research excellence in Canada by strengthening partnerships, bridging capacity, mobilizing knowledge, and championing CBR among individuals, communities, and institutions. For 10 years, CBR Canada has brought together key players of community campus partnerships. You can see the chat box in Zoom, so please, and we'll be bringing them up at the end in the final question and answer period. So we look forward to your questions and comments. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce today's speakers, Anne-Marie Beals and Dr. Cian Wilson. Anne-Marie is a Two-Spirit, Indigenous-Black Lenape, a mixed-blood African Nova Scotian, and First Nation Mi'kmaq. Anne-Marie is a graduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University and a storyteller working on the proclaimingourroots.com project. Stories from this project revolve around Afro-Indigenous identity and relationships with Indigenous and Black communities. Anne-Marie's research explores the health and well-being of these communities and looking at the effects of colonial legacies of oppression and violence and lack of acknowledgement of Indigenous Black identity in the Canadian settler nation state. Anne-Marie shares Afro-Indigenous voices in uplifting the sacred stories of resilience, strength, self-assertion, and consciousness raising through the lived experiences and knowledges loudly resonating in Indigenous Black communities. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Cian Wilson, who is an associate professor of Wilfrid Laurier University and the co-director of the Center for Community Research, Learning and Action, who is, and Cian is Afro, Indo, and Euro-Jamaican ancestry. She has over a decade of experience working with African, Caribbean, and Black communities across the Greater Toronto Area, first as a youth programmer and now as a health researcher. Her research interests build off of her community-engaged work to include critical race theory, anti-decolonial theory, African diasporic and Indigenous community health, HIV/AIDS, sexual and reproductive well-being, and community-based research. Her body of work aims to utilize research as an avenue for sharing the stories and realities of African, diasporic, Indigenous, and racialized peoples, and improving the health and well-being of these communities. So we're so pleased to have Anne-Marie and Dr. Cian share their work today with us. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to both of you.
Thanks so much, Julia. And so you could go to the next slide, I guess, in this case. As we sort of begin, and thanks so much for the land acknowledgements and opening with that. It's a super important, I think, not just practice, but I think for me, it's a personally important process in acknowledging where it is that I'm doing the work that I do and where it is that I'm situated in working with both Black and Indigenous communities and also communities that are mixed Black and Indigenous. And so for me, you know, all of this work around social justice, inclusion, all of these conversations around whether it's sovereignty seeking or equity seeking groups is not possible if we don't acknowledge, the land upon which this work is being done, the proper stewards of this territory, unceded territory, and the importance of that in terms of acknowledging ongoing colonialism. And so, really, really important, I think, aspect to the work, and to go beyond just land acknowledgements in our daily practice as well, is also incredibly important. It's also really timely, given the work that we're going to be talking about today around mixed Indigenous and Black folks on Turtle Island. And so we can go to the next slide, and Anne-Marie will talk a little bit more about this project that we've been engaged in. No?
Actually, if we could go back to the other slide, that would be good. Go backwards, one slide. Thank you. So just as a correction here, we are Mi'kmaq from Mi'kma'ki territory of the Wabanaki Confederacy. So Micmac is a colonizer word used to describe us in a revisionist history. So I just wanted to make that correction. So we are Mi'kmaq. And so it's important to name that. And it's also necessary to acknowledge and incorporate Indigenous perspectives in our work as part of the broader African diaspora with Indigenous roots in the continent of Africa and in India. It is also about honoring the rightful stewards of this unceded territory in which we stand, how we come to be here on Turtle Island in proximity to each other in the set of situational relationships as white, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So who discovered North America? North America's discovery makes sense of that. It is impossible to discover a people in a continent that was already there and thriving with culture. One can only wonder how Columbus could have discovered America when people were watching him from the shores of Turtle Island. Make no mistake, terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery are imperial myths used to justify the genocide of Indigenous people and the theft of lands. Next slide, please.
So given that this is, this conversation is for CBR Canada and the groups of folks who are in this audience who are possibly practitioners of community-based research or immersed in community-based research themselves, I felt it was really important to start by also talking a little bit about, where CBR, this approach to research, is grounded and where it's founded. And we understand community and participatory research and all of the sort of, veins of that kind of work to be engaging with communities. But what a lot of folks don't often discuss is how community-based research is often this very sanitized, westernized version of Indigenous research, which has always involved and centered community voices, has always been about engaging with community. So whether we look at the work of Freer in South America and many other practitioners in Freer's era that were doing very similar, work, the research and work of False Borda, we look at South Africa, we look at, all of these other contexts in which Indigenous communities were quite immersed in what we would call community-based research in the contemporary moment. So for us, acknowledging, the work of the folks that came before, acknowledging that community-based research is very much a Western institutionalized version of work that comes out of this longer history. And of course, we know these pillars very well as community-driven, community-relevant, all of these principles that underpin CBR, acknowledging that longer history. And you can go to the next slide. And this talks a little bit more about this. This actually is a model around Indigenous epistemologies that comes from Sean Wilson's book, Research as Ceremony, and that was published in 2008. And in Wilson's book, again, you see very, very much encompassed a lot of the same tenets of community-based research, really showing that embedded in Indigenous research has always been these practices of community-based work. So whether that's relationship to self and communities and environment and land, very integral to an Indigenous worldview and an Indigenous framework to research and work in communities that is beneficial to communities. And so really wanting to acknowledge the roots from which CBR comes. You can go to the next slide.
So within Black feminist thought, there are several considerations regarding community-based research. So we understand the consideration of lived experiences in our communities and the criterion of epistemology. Our knowledge is knowledge. It's not folklore. It's not relegated to the margins, but it's instead at the forefront of what we do. We work to understand and benefit our communities. Reflexively, we do not reinscribe positivist methodological approaches that have historically harmed our communities, and we hold ourselves accountable in understanding that research is responsibility. We utilize an intersectional perspective in understanding how oppressive forces and power affect BIPOC and systemically marginalized communities. That's a necessity in CBR. Next slide, please.
And so as you know from the title, we're going to be presenting a little bit about the Proclaiming Our Roots project, which I've had the great honor of leading as a principal investigator on this project. And before we get really into the project over the next few slides, I wanted to sort of hail up the artist of this particular of one of our emblems for the project. This actually was the art work on our flyers that went out to recruit participants. And really, because of the beauty of the art, it attracted so many participants from across the country who were really interested in learning more about what we were trying to do. And so this was created by artist Melissa Watson, and their work, embroiled in their work, you can actually see, remnants and reflections of cultures that are both continental African as well as indigenous to North America. Everything from, the buffalo, you can see actually the continents in the body of the buffalo, the shield, the Kenyan shield, as well as other sort of artifacts and cultural references to both cultures. And so really, really important work by an Indigenous-Black artist, Melissa Watson, and wanting to convey the two cultures that were coming together in the work that we are going to talk a little bit more about. You can go to the next slide. As many of you know, as community-based practitioners and folks who might be interested in this work, it takes a village to get any of these kinds of projects off the ground, as well as immersion in relationships, right? And that's been very, very important to our process as well. And so I really want to acknowledge the wonderful people that have made this project possible. And just going from the images of some of the key players, we'll go from the top left there, which is Sarah Flicker, who was my co-investigator. We've got Anique Jordan, who's an artist facilitator and actually took us through the process of doing the digital storytelling. Of course, you see Anne-Marie on the bottom left. And if you go to the right, Denise Baldwin, who was a really integral part of this process in sort of visioning what this project was about from the very inception. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Just below Denise on the right side, Rashida Simons. Rashida was doing a lot of the on-the-ground work in Halifax in terms of booking space and getting community out and, all of those really integral pieces that make this work possible. And of course, Benita Lawrence, whose work really inspired and informed this work. Benita is a Mi'kmaq scholar who works out of York University. There's also some really other important names to mention. Conrad Prince, for example, an Indigenous-Black man who works in the research as well as child welfare world. And so really, really important contributions from a lot of really important folks throughout this entire process. A little bit more about the how this project came to be. It was around 2014, 2015 when Denise and myself started talking a little bit about Indigenous-Black presence and history in Canada and how that history has been virtually erased, in terms of the Canadian consciousness. There isn't a lot of conversation about it. And for folks who recalled, there was also a lot happening around truth and reconciliation at the time. And there was a lot of conversation amongst Denise and myself about where in that conversation, the histories and realities of mixed Indigenous-Black people actually belongs if we're not included in that conversation. And so we got to talking, and really the inception of the project comes out of a lot of those conversations and was really inspired by that early visioning that Denise and I did. Another really important part and aspect of this project is that this project was predominantly led by Indigenous and or Black folks. And that was really, really integral. There were so many times where participants came, through the door and they were like, you have no idea how happy I am to see so many brown faces in this space, right? And that was overall a comment that folks felt at home, they felt comfortable, and they were really concerned that they were going to walk into a space that was predominantly white-led, and then they would have to be sort of voyeuristically explaining their own testimonies of their own experiences. And we're really concerned about that, actually, and how, just having our presence as folks who understood their experiences, how much that was so much more welcoming. And so with that, there was this interesting conversation of, what are the roles of white allies? And in this space, Sarah played a really integral role in terms of, supporting the grant, using her sort of own sort of academic capital, if you will, to support the grant. While at the same time, what was really important was that this space was Indigenous and Black led. And we'll talk more about the importance and significance of that as you'll see some of the outcomes of this work. Go to the next slide.
So the Proclaiming Our Roots project has 3 main objectives, which include creating narratives of the intersections and lived experiences of Indigenous Black people. So as you see from the stated objectives, we wanted to historicize the existence of mixed Indigenous Black people in the Canadian mosaic and explore how Indigenous Black people survive in the context of colonial structures, such as capitalism, racism, intersectional oppression, structural inequities, lack of territory, and social, cultural, and geographic displacement, and the implications of these multiple intersection forms of violence on the overall health and well-being of Indigenous Black people. Moreover, the project interrogates what the truth and reconciliation process has meant and what is required for Indigenous Black people to move forward with the inclusion in this process. And next slide, please. So our first workshop in 2017 was held in Toronto, Ontario. Our second in 2018, and representing Halifax and Dartmouth and surrounding communities in Nova Scotia, was held in the region of the communities of North Preston, East Preston, Lake Loon, and Cherrybrook. And we had a community member in Winnipeg share their story as well. Next slide, please.
And so here's a little bit about our method. So we combine traditional qualitative methods such as interviewing with arts-based methods such as digital storytelling, which afforded community members and participants the opportunity to layer their images, sound, music, and text in the creation of personal videos about their lived experiences, realities, and histories as Indigenous Black peoples. We also participated in this virtual or digital community mapping process in which community members were able to pinpoint, through, Google Maps, their family histories and origins and the geographies on a digital map, and then sort of every single point, if you actually look at our website, every single point that you press on, it tells a little bit of a story about that family, or the origins and the roots that folks were sort of talking a little bit about in terms of their family history. And we also audio recorded individual semi-structured interviews. All of the interviews were recorded, as well as the group dialogue sessions as we were creating these digital stories in that weekend-long workshop. So we went from roughly Friday evening to Monday evening in terms of timeline. So it was one whole sort of like weekend that folks were dedicating to the digital storytelling process, and all of those conversations were recorded. You can go on to the next slide. Okay, so after, so what you're seeing here is kind of like a layout of our process. So we had these 2 workshops, one in Toronto, one in Halifax, as Anne-Marie talked about. And in each of these workshops, these were the digital storytelling workshops that where, all of these stories were created, all of the data was gathered from all of the formats that we just talked about. And then we actually, would screen the stories both within the workshops, just so the participants were able to see their stories. And then again, in community launches where they were able to share their stories with a broader array of folks in their larger communities to spark larger discussions in the larger community. And so that was what the community launches were. We held 3 community launches throughout 2018, one in Toronto, one in Dartmouth, and the other in Halifax, as those 2 communities are literally a bridge apart, and roughly 40 or 50-minute drive. And so it was really important to, again, based on the geographic dispersion of Indigenous Black communities in Halifax, Dartmouth, to have those 2 locales covered. And if you go to the next slides, you'll actually see some of those locations pointed out. So this is where we held our workshop, and Anne-Marie's going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in Toronto, we held the digital story workshop at the Youth Action Network because it's a wonderful community space. It's open and accessible. It has a kitchen where we hired a caterer from Indigenous and Black community. And we had a beloved elder open and close our space in ceremony, and who also participated in the workshop. So it became a learning and sharing space for all of us who were situated there. Next slide. And for our workshop out east, and unbeknownst to both Sian and I, the community center space that was booked was on the grounds of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. So this space was booked by a member of the Indigenous-Black community, our ground coordinator, as it was one of the few community spaces available. So this particular community space holds many feelings and emotions for me. And I think about this in the context of being an insider-outsider researcher. So just a little background on that. My mother spent the majority of her childhood, youth, and young adulthood at this Black residential center known colloquially as the Home. So she was sent to this orphanage at around the age of 5. And the Home, which opened in 1921, was built because white orphanages would not accept Indigenous or Black children, as segregation was alive and well as an arm of colonial racism. So as an example, the last segregated school in Canada closed in 1983 in Guysborough, Nova Scotia. So as we speak, there's a provincial inquiry and a class action lawsuit pending for many residents and their families of the Home who were subjected to physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse during their time in placement. These experiences are not altogether dissimilar from Indigenous peoples who participated in the Truth and Reconciliation process in reliving their trauma inflicted by the agents of the nation state at residential schools. And like residential schools, some children didn't make it out of these systems. At the Home, there are children who are actually buried on the grounds of the Home. Next slide, please.
Now, in terms of where we held our community launches, and again, the community launches were where we shared the digital stories with a larger audience of folks. Some of those folks I actually noticed are in the audience today as well. Oh, we're no longer on the slide deck, Julia. We're now seeing your personal messages. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, so as I was saying, some folks are actually in the audience today as well. So we held one of those sessions at the YMCA in Toronto, and after much conversation with our participants, it made sense to have something that was centrally located in Toronto, just based on where everyone was living and geographically dispersed. So that's where one community launch was mentioned, or sorry, where it was held. You can go to the next slide. And then when it came to the to out east in Nova Scotia, we held again the two, one in Dartmouth at the Black Cultural Center, and then one in Halifax at the Bus Stop Theatre. Again, based on geography, accessibility, all of those sorts of things were really, really important and weighed heavily in terms of why we held at these locations. And then you can go to the next slide. In terms of where you all can check out the videos and all of the outputs from this project, you can check out all of this on the proclaimingourroots.com website, where you can find our digital stories and so on. Based on this online modality, we unfortunately aren't going to share any of the videos with you today, but please do check out our website for all of the articles, community reports, anything else that comes out of the project. You can get a pulse of what we're up to through the project website. And we'll go to the next slide. Henry.
So storytelling and sharing our stories as a process of rehistoricizing and decolonizing is so pivotal to the practices of Indigenous peoples around the world, from the African continent to Turtle Island, and therefore pivotal to this project. Dr. Jomo Mutiji reminds us to write our stories, draw our stories, paint our stories, sculpt our stories. Do so without reservation, without qualification, and without hesitation, so we remember. And in remembering, we want to share some of the moments about the digital stories so you get a sense of this method and the amazing people we've had the privilege of working with. We are hopeful that you will view the beautiful stories shared on the project website and corresponding YouTube page. So in this particular slide, you can see images from Rashida and Isaac's stories. All of the stories situated community members in their Indigenous Black heritages through the use of imagery, text, poetry, music, etc. In the case of Isaac's story in particular, much to the pleasure of his foreparents and ancestors, Isaac has recently gotten his community and their territory nationally acknowledged. His digital story was intended to document some of the process, as well as to share with his family. which he was able to do with his grandfather before his journey to be with the ancestors. Next slide, please. So with these digital stories, we wanted to give you some context about how Indigenous Black people come to be in Northern Turtle Island. African diasporic presence in Canada dates back over 400 years, due in large part, but not exclusively to, the nation-state participation in the British North American enslavement trade as early as 1685. And some have documented this even earlier. Indigenous and African diasporic communities experience shared as well as distinct forms of colonial oppression and conflict. Relationships between African diasporic and Indigenous peoples were feared by colonists because of white settler desire to maintain spatial boundaries between the so-called distinct racial groups and ensure white settler control over land and resources. Despite the government's prohibitions, mixed unions between Indigenous and Black people developed and flourished, sometimes as a form of resistance to colonial oppression. To date, Indigenous and Black unions are common within many communities, like the Ojibwe of Enderdawn and Batchewana First Nation in Ontario, and the Creek, Lumbee, Creole, and Seminole communities. Intermarriage between African Nova Scotians and the Mi'kmaq proliferated as forms of resistance to extermination policies against the Mi'kmaq, and the marginalization of multi-generational Black loyalists, refugees from the War of 1812, Caribbean migrants such as the Maroons, and freedom seekers escaping enslavement. Indigenous Black communities have been recognized in the United States for hundreds of years. However, we remain a largely neglected group here in Canada. Across disciplines and nationally as well as internationally, Indigenous Black communities have been historically under-researched and denied active participation as Indigenous Black people in this society. Next slide, please.
Unsurprisingly, social movements within Indigenous and African diasporic communities in the Americas have historically informed and inspired each other. For instance, African slaves joined the communities of Indigenous Caribs on the island of St. Vincent, who waged the First Carib War of 1773 and greatly reduced European control of their territory. Black Seminoles are a tribe of Native and African American people who, after intermarrying and exchanging their cultural identities, became a single people. The Seminoles would go on to carry out one of the strongest resistance struggles in the US, namely the 30-year Seminole War that began in 1812 after colonists attempted to re-enslave and separate African members of the community from their Indigenous brothers and sisters. Similarly, slaves of both Indigenous Taino and African ancestry played a central role in the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Integral to the Haitian Revolution were Taino and African spiritual practices and belief systems, such as voodoo. There is also much speculation of the Arawak and African diasporic ancestry of Maroons in Jamaica. And actually, some of the images that you're looking at here are from Sangster International Airport in Jamaica, in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And you see a little bit of that Indigenous and African ancestry, both the Taino as well as Nanny Maroon, who was a member of the Maroon community there, and lots of conversations about the Indigenous and African ancestry of the Maroon community. Going on to the next slide.
So Lee Markel and Patricia Hill Collins highlight how the Black Power movement and the work of Frantz Fanon inspired the Red Power movement, the Yellow Power movement, and People Power movements across the Americas and around the world, like the Chicano and Puerto Rican liberation movements, and the Black Power movements in Indigenous communities in Australasia, South America, and continental Africa. In Indigenous protests in this settler nation state, such as the Caledonia land dispute, fought by Six Nation land defenders, 1492 Land Back Lane, and Indigenous supporters, Black activists are allies who are there to support Indigenous communities in their fight for sovereignty and against the brutality of the enforcers of the nation state. The Black Lives Matter Toronto chapter put forth their support for the Indigenous youth of the Attawapiskat community who demanded recreational resources and educational and employment opportunities in the wake of alarming youth suicides.
And in fact, if you look at
slide,
these,
please.
oh, sorry, I was going to say, Anne-Marie, before you go to the next slide, I was going to say, based on the images, you're actually looking at, for example, a lot of the social justice movements in the 60s and 70s, Muhammad Ali, as well as Indigenous activists at that time. When you look at the middle image, that's actually a painting of the Haitian Revolution, where you do have, again, Indigenous Taino as well as African, revolt, very integral to that. And then what was Anne-Marie was talking about with the Attawapiskat youth and Black Lives Matter, Toronto supporting that movement. That's the image that you see on the far right. You can go to the next slide.
Powerful images and statements from Indigenous scholars and activists such as Leanne Simpson have also been created in the wake of the connections between Indigenous-Black communities and solidarity and working towards strengthening our communities and self-determination. So these are pretty powerful images. Next slide, please. So in discussing the impact of the work, one of the most transformative outcomes of this work is witnessing the upliftment of Indigenous-Black people who are naming and claiming their identities and spaces within our communities, regardless of colonial blood quantum and one-drop rules. We have felt silenced and shamed from doing so before, but are now empowered with the self-determination to move our agenda forward, and that we will not be chained to oppressive and divisive policies, laws, and social mindsets, not only in our communities, but throughout Turtle Island. Community members from the workshops have gone on to do so many tremendous things. Isaac has documented in various ways the history of his people, the Ojibwa of Enderdawn. As mentioned, Isaac has also gone on to advocate and lobby for his community to become a sovereign territory. Carson, whose digital story spoke to the racism he faced in the education system that stumped his progress in school, has since gone on to pursue higher education. Tanya Paris incorporates her cultures in her art praxis. Larissa has gone on to do many amazing things, not the least of which is to write a HuffPost article where she acknowledges the project's role in her own journey of finding her identity in history. In Toronto, Keisha has gone on to start an arts-based project for Afro-Indigenous people, youth in particular. And Kayla, as a PhD student, is doing amazing things at the University of Toronto and beyond. And next slide, please.
And in an effort to, put some more shine on our participants in terms of their reflections on both the processes as well as what it's meant and the impact in terms of their well-being, their mental health, sense of belonging, and how they navigate their identities, we wanted to share some of the quotes that came out, the really powerful quotes that came out of some of our correspondence and our conversations throughout this process. So in this particular quote, the participant says, and this is a Toronto participant, says, "I'm tired of this anti-Black racism. I'm fucking tired of it. So that's telling me that I need to go out and do my own thing. So it's helping my mental health in dealing with fucking work. And I've treated this as a retreat for myself, this being the workshop, the process. So in my heart, I feel better now because this is my community. After this, I don't have one. It's just my family. So oftentimes it's very lonely. I don't get time not having to be on guard." And so what this participant is regarding is just the importance and the special significance of the space that was cultivated for Indigenous-Black people throughout this process. You can go to the next slide. And so this participant says, "The workshop had me. I really thought about myself as an individual and things that I have been blocking for a long time, but it allows me to be more vocal about this identity, and it allows me to, like, what else can we do as a collective for people to know this, because it is constantly erased and erased and erased, and it puts Black and Indigenous people as outsiders, and they have been outsiders for a long time." And we can go to the next slide. Okay. And
So
this last
community members.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So this community member speaks about, I felt like I couldn't go through this, and then this research project came along. I was super validating to have a lot of people with commonalities and to just share, like, you've been doing something that was messed up in the past. Say, me too. Okay. You don't know how to navigate some of your identities? So yeah, I appreciated the opportunity to come together as a family, to talk about as a community what we've been through. It's always good to share your story. It is something very healing. And I feel that. it's almost like the expectation that you have to be Black or Indigenous. You can't be both, can't be neither. And so it's really just reaffirming to have these conversations with people who understand what you feel and know what you mean. And then looking at it through the research perspective, it's like, I'm here on the inside, but I'm also here on the outside. And what does that look like for me? And thinking about how I reaffirm with those who are like me. It's a powerful thing. Next slide, please.
So in terms of our community launches, we also sort of took a stock of what people were saying from our community launches as well, what community members who were viewing these stories sometimes for the first time, who had an opportunity to reflect on that, what they had to say. So some other quotes from folks, the project was really transformative and empowering. The space has been a very safe space. It was a safe space and I felt extremely comfortable. I appreciate the unity and the sense of family that was established. And so these are some of the participants. I was a Halifax participant. It was just such a great opportunity for Black Indigenous people to come together. And it was just great to have people come up to me and talk and say, you look like my cousin. Just keep on doing what you're doing, because what you're doing, I think it's very good. Halifax participant. I'm like crying. Everyone is like the timing of this project. Like it's time. Everybody is like, it's time. It's time. We have been waiting for you and this project for a very long time, commented one attendee at the Toronto community launch. And lastly, so these are just some of the different perspectives and different views that folks brought. And again, in this time, if you recall, especially 2015 with the release of the report of Truth and Reconciliation, those conversations really weighed really heavily on what people were thinking about around Indigenous and Black identity and resistance to, settler colonialism, and really thinking through what all of this, the implications of all of this for this project. So we'll go to the next slide. In terms of what's next, in terms of this particular process and where we're heading next, we continue to write and analyze the data. Some of that information has already been published by Anne-Marie and myself, and we've got some other pieces that are coming forward from other team members as well. And so that's some of the work that we're doing, sharing this work continuously in platforms like this one, applying for continued funding to build upon this work. And so we actually recently got funded through the Indigenous Gender Wellness program through CIHR to continue some of this work in terms of rolling out toolkits and resources, as well as another workshop of bringing people together, bringing this community and this growing community of folks together. And so that's some of where we're going. And we also just submitted for some other grants to make this happen and to support this work, as well as bridging with other really important Indigenous and Black archival work that's happening, including the Lynn Jones collection, for example, out in Halifax. And so there's lots of things that are up and coming, building toolkits and community reports and that sort of thing. So there's lots to come with this project. It's definitely not over. And so that's a lot of where we're going. You'll see some of our publications at the very bottom, and that's just a short list. I think there's this is half of the list of things that we've actually output thus far. And we'll go to the final slide.
I have a question for you, Sian.
Yep, go ahead.
Would you say that the Proclaiming Our Roots project had taken on a life of its own in a sense?
I would say so. I would say that just based on where participants have gone, and you sort of listed just some of the things that people are doing with the work, in terms of creating art and writing papers, entire Huffington Post articles about the impact of the project. Definitely, I would say that it's taken on a life of its own because it was so community driven and community led, and people felt it a really important space. I don't know, what would you say about that question?
Well, I was thinking about the work with Frere, and I think it really lended itself to a sense of critical consciousness raising as well. And that because we are working through, like in these digital stories, as a form of healing as well, raising the consciousness and who we are, and to be proud of who we are and our identities, and being able to embrace both sides of our identities, I think is crucial. And we're spreading that. We're spreading that throughout Turtle Island. And I think it's a really powerful kind of thing, because part of the work in CBR, I guess, is defining what is community and what's that like. And so we're bringing people into the community, into the Indigenous-Black community, and we're raising that critical consciousness that's being raised by members of the community and spreading it out. I think it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because we've also had a lot of connections with other Indigenous-Black communities across North America, like in Florida and in Louisiana, for example, who've reached out to be like, how did you guys get to do this so quickly? And how did you guys get to this first? We've been doing this work for such a long time, but haven't, done a project quite like this. And so getting in touch to get ideas and exchanging ideas as well. So the momentum is certainly building, not just nationally, but also I would say internationally as well. So it's great. And so one of the last points that we wanted to sort of leave you with is sort of to bring all of this back to talking a little bit about CBR and what we felt about this project and reflecting on this as to why it might have been successful. And I'm going to also open the space for Anne-Marie to talk a little bit about your reflections on some of these points. So I'll pause after each point in case you want to add anything, Anne-Marie. But my first point here was that CBR needs to be community driven in order to be transformative. This means communities need to drive the priorities of the project because ultimately they know what they need and will be the ones to incorporate and address the project findings or sort of bring it further. So to Anne-Marie's point, the participants were the ones who were so integral to bringing this to the next step. So whether that was attending the Indigenous Gender Wellness Fair and pushing for a grant or, writing pieces and incorporating this work in their art and their other work and having it motivate them to pursue education. All of those things would not be possible if it wasn't community owned. Anne-Marie, any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I would just add to that sometimes we think because we're in academia that we know what's best. So I guess really just taking a step back and listening and finding out what it is that community members desire to see as transformative change really could be what we need to do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another point, so connect to that directly, is that a researcher's role, in my opinion, is to garner the resources, whether that's through grant funding or institutional and academic support from your university, but then to work alongside community members with all of those resources in tow, and your job is to make them available. You're bringing the tools, the research methods maybe, and you're bringing the funding and the resources, but your job is really to support the visioning of what the community members want to see. And then the next point,
I think you spoke to that a bit.
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, you talked about that with Sarah, and as an ally being able to use that capital to seek the funding where we can get it. And I think we have more Indigenous and Black and Indigenous-Black students coming to the Academy or fighting to get there, that we can also develop we can develop that capital to access those resources.
Mm-hmm. I think another important part of this was that whiteness and power in the in so much of what academia is sort of nested in, as well as so many processes, even outside of academia, not in the nonprofit sector as well, I would say very similarly, where a lot of the community-based work is happening, in fact, right? It cannot be, so CBR can't be transformational if we can't decenter whiteness and power dynamics in the sort of traditional way in which they've been embroiled. This is especially true when working with equity-seeking groups such as racialized or Indigenous peoples. I think it's really, really important that be decentered. And over again, that was something that we heard from participants, that it was so important for them to see themselves reflected in the team of people that were putting this together, because there was a sense of trust there, and there was a sense of relational building that was possible, that would not have been possible otherwise. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, no, enough said on that. That's good.
And the last point then is that community members will be more involved and engaged in a process if they can see the benefit of expending their limited time to partake in a project. The role of the researcher will be to continuously demonstrate the benefit, to power share, and to be accountable to communities. And this one's really important as well. And I think it just builds on the prior points in saying that communities will be engaged. I mean, a lot of folks always ask, how do you get communities engaged? It's like, well, is the project beneficial to them, or is it a waste of their time? So how do you've got to make efforts to show them and demonstrate and actually be accountable to, the output of that research and that work being beneficial to communities. And that will be, that relationship building and that trust and that accountability that you're holding to communities, that they're going to hold you to that, and that's really, really important in terms of process and outputs of a project. And so I think, you know, meaningful relationship building is really integral to all of this. I don't think I have to belabor that particular point, but certainly if you can show and demonstrate the beneficial, you know, nature of the work, you know, folks will come to the table. And so, you know, they've got limited time, but they're willing. And so that was the final point there. And so our last slide is just sort of like a thank you for sort of listening, and we're going to open the floor for questions at this point and some discussion. And so Julia, I don't know if you want to, you know, start to facilitate that.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sian and Anne-Marie. This is absolutely incredible, and we just so appreciate you sharing all your work, your thoughts, and some of what the amazing outcomes that your work has led to from the communities that participated in, the individuals participating in this Proclaiming Our Roots project. It seemed to affect them so deeply, and have just incredible offshoots, which are very, very inspiring. I wanted to mention, I know one person was asking, and I'm sure many others are interested, so this webinar is being recorded. So you can find the webinar recording. There's a URL at the bottom of the screen, communityresearchcanada.ca/learning together. So that we'll post it very, very soon, tomorrow or early next week. So I see some questions coming in, so I'm going to take a quick look here. Feel free also if you want to raise your hand, and I'm going to try to turn on your mic, but for now I'm going to ask some of the questions coming in through the chat box. So we have Heather, who's asked, do you expect to go back to the same geographic communities in a future stage of research, or to engage with new communities?
Sorry, so the question is, do we expect to engage with new communities, or or as in the next stages, the next phases of the work?
Yeah, in the next phase.
Yeah, so we do anticipate to build not only the capacity of the folks who are interested and participated in the first round in terms of their interests in learning how to facilitate digital storytelling as a process, but also, yes, you know, involving a larger swath of folks from across the country who are Indigenous-Black.
Thanks, Sian. This is actually a really interesting question from Neural. He's asking a question about, is racism, discrimination for ethnic Black people worse in Canada or in America after George Floyd's death, and why? Any opinions or I guess about that question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't, and Anne-Marie, you may have your opinions on this. I don't know if it's a better or worse conversation. It's we're having more conversations, and George Floyd is not the first person in the last 5 years that we've had this conversation around. There was Trayvon Martin, there was, you know, so many other folks, right? Yeah. So many other people, including what's happening here in Canada as well. So we don't want to ignore, you know, the murders of folks like Anthony out in Brampton, or Regis Paquayette, or, you know, just all of the different things that have happened while under police, you know, surveillance. These folks have either been harmed or killed, and so we don't want to ignore that. The DeFont Miller case, you know, so is it worse? No, I think that it's just more conversations that we're having about it. You know, we as Indigenous and Black folks have always known, and always known this to be the case in both nation states of Canada and the US, and we're finally able to, now it's a national conversation. Now white folks are waking up to racism is essentially what's happening. We've always known it's been here. I don't know, Anne-Marie, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. I have some thoughts, because it's kind of like what we talked about CBR from an intersectional perspective, and we revel in the beauty of all of the identities that who we are, and the systemic, you know, the systems that have put the burdens on our identities. So one of the things that I do as a student, as part of my CBR work, is that myth busting of the niceness and the politeness and the you know, less racism here in this particular nation state than south of the border, that colonial border. So perhaps it has given rise to exposing the racism and the Indigenous erasure in this particular nation state, but the conversation, as Sian said, we've been having these conversations for over 400 years and have been actively working to lift the mantle of oppression that rains down on our various identities. So, yeah, it's a different space. Maybe we're getting a little bit more exposure, but I don't think it's anything different now.
Thanks for your comments on that. And perhaps that's something with identity. We're having a conversation next week about researcher identity and privilege. So that's kind of a big one. And what Anne-Marie brought up about Canada and maybe thinking we're very different from US, and it's maybe not so. So it's interesting to unpack that. We have some more questions over the next few minutes. So I've got one from Diana, who's asking, how feasible is it to conduct a community-based research during PhD? Also, particularly if we have not been able to secure larger grants to fund our research.
Yeah, it's a great question. They've all been great questions. Sorry, I didn't want to say that the ones before weren't great. They're all great, but this one's a good question in terms of the time. So I mean, while I would not encourage anyone to engage in a process like we did with so many different methods, and it was, you know, this national sort of scope for a PhD, I think that's probably a little bit overwhelming. Certainly community-based research can be engaged in the scope of a PhD. You probably need a minimum of 2 years to, you know, and especially if it's communities that you've already got rapport with, even better. I would encourage strongly for students to work with communities that you belong to, that you have rapport with, that you have meaningful relationships with, and not, wander off to do work with communities that you don't know, and folks that you're, then having to do a lot of work to build those relationships with, that take time, that necessarily take time. And then you're in this place where you're feeling you've got to rush a process that actually requires that time. And so I encourage folks to think really strategically about that and really intentionally about that, because you're not going to do yourself a service or the community a service if you're going to rush a process. So yes, I actually worked with community-based and arts-based methods in my own doctoral work, and many people have, where I brought Indigenous and Black youth together around HIV prevention leadership, and we did mural making in our process as an example of how I immersed in this. Now, mind you, all of these young people I had some relationship with prior, which is part of the reason it worked. Hence that thing around meaningful relationships and having rapport prior being really important. And so that's some of the ways in which folks can. And Marie, I don't know, you're in your PhD. Do you want to answer that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because this is something I've and other PhD students that I talk with have given some thought to. So for me, being a PhD student is a form of resistance in the academy. That's how I feel about my many years of being in the academy. So I guess in a positive sense, we're always thinking about, or we're expected to be thinking about publishing or perishing, about the outputs of what our time at the university is. And so as a form of resistance for me, I'm clapping back against having to think about how many publications I need to have, or how many outputs I have to have, because working in community, as Sian says, it takes time, and you need to have relationships and resources. And so for me, it's a form of resistance and not subscribing to those unspoken and sometimes spoken rules of what are the requirements of completing a PhD. So I see that, as I said, as a form of resistance in not thinking about, and also being somewhat transformative in what is expected of us at those upper levels, so that we're not being punished in a sense for not maybe having as much outputs as students in other disciplines, for instance. Because I'm in community psychology, I guess I should say that. So that's kind of a form of resistance for me.
Yeah, and I think
thanks. I know that. Oh, go ahead, Sian. Yeah.
I was going to say, and what and Marie's highlighting too is that community-based work necessarily takes more time. Right. And I cannot hammer that point home enough. Like, it's going to take more time. It takes more time to build these relationships, to engage with any single one of these methods. And there are many. I would encourage folks to look at Linda Toohey's book, Decolonizing Methodology, chapter 25, I think it is. Yeah, just remarkable, all kinds of different methods that one can employ. Yeah, I think that, you know, it takes necessarily more time, and it's important that you plan for that time if you're going to engage with it. One of the other aspects of the question that I think came out was, what if you don't have resources? Well, some of the ways that folks can work around that is nesting their work in maybe their supervisor's larger work. So if you have a supervisor who does this work, nesting your own dissertation in that larger work, if there's a synergy and that makes sense, as one approach. And another part of it is, if you're not able to nest your work, the other aspect is, if you do have relationships with the communities that you're working with, that also bodes well for you in terms of feasibility, in terms of all of these things that folks, you know, are concerned about in terms of expenses for a research project. So Julie, I cut you off. You can go ahead.
No, I think it's definitely a big conversation. I remember that this community is kind of looking to have, and something maybe we want to keep expanding on, because it does flip kind of priorities of what the role of a researcher is, and acknowledging the work of community-based researchers. So it does kind of allude to a bigger kind of structure, or how do we acknowledge the work? So definitely something that maybe as a group we can keep talking about. I wanted to ask you one more question, and before we go, and I had something that really struck me watching the videos, the Proclaiming Our Roots videos, which, please, if you're, you know, please check them out if you're listening. They're really incredibly well put together, and each one of them was so thoughtfully done, artistically done. Some of them talk about just, you really educated about some history that you maybe would never hear otherwise. So I mean, that piece that you're talking about integrating in the curriculum, like, where is that going, or what was your vision for that?
Yeah, so it's some of actually what we're looking at right now, in the next phase of this work and building this out, is how to create resources that are going to be likely housed on the website, that one, I think, engages folks in this process of digital storytelling. So folks are ever interested in doing these stories in their own communities, which is one of the things that community members said over and over again. Oh, I would love to do this at home with my relatives and facilitate this. And so part of the capacity building that I was talking about earlier, of building the capacity of prior participants to facilitate this with new participants from across the country, that's kind of how it's going to each one teach one kind of model. But building a curriculum around digital storytelling as a process. So that's one thing. And then the other piece is also in encouraging folks to engage with the digital stories, the website, and all of the other outputs that will be put on this platform that we're creating around Indigenous-Black history in Canada. As a form of as a teachable platform, as a teachable pieces of things that folks can sort of share in their classrooms, or share with their kids, or and sort of teach a little bit about this rich history that is often not talked about in textbooks, and it's not talked about in the larger Canadian consciousness of this nation state, right? And so the two pieces, when I talk about curriculum, that we've thought quite a bit about, and we're still thinking about and massaging those ideas as we go forward in terms of our next steps.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful, and please share that with us when you when you have it ready, because we'd love to kind of share that out. And before we leave, and also personally, I'd love to see my own daughter kind of use that, or see that in her school and things like that. So I wanted to just raise everybody's attention to join us again next week. And again, just really want to thank Sienna and Marie for this really inspiring story of your work, and that's going to continue to happen. And just keep us in the loop with as the project unfolds. But please join us next week, same time, 12 noon EST, on next Thursday, October 29th, where we're going to have live discussion as a community. So next time we're all going to be talking together. So your videos and audio will be in breakout groups And we'll be discussing a big question that will be coming out of this conversation driven by our speakers today. So really look forward to having you there, and you can register still. You can see the link below, communityresearchcanada.ca/events. And also, please join our final webinar and discussion of the series in November on the theme of decolonizing research systems. So an exciting final session for this series that we're excited to have you participate in. And yeah, please tell us what you thought. We are trying a couple of new things out today, including the closed captioning. So share your feedback, and thank you again for participating today, and to Cian and Anne-Marie. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thank you, Miigwech.